Welcome, everybody, and thanks for coming to this month's session of our Student Research Council on Political Theory. Today, Lisa Carroll will give a presentation on climate change and the social construct. So without further ado, go ahead, Lisa.
Yeah, so today I'm presenting on climate change and the social contract. It's important to note because we've had a few webinars. This isn't really part of my master's degree. It's also not part of any thesis or paper that I'm currently working on, but it's how I've gone about thinking about how to integrate climate change into the social contract rather than a specific theory in itself. So the first thing I'm going to do is define my terms. If you were at the last webinar, you know that that's sort of a pet peeve of mine, is when people aren't specific about the terms that they're using, especially in political theory. I think that's a major problem. And I'll move on to social contract theory, and then lay out how the social contract, why it's applicable to climate change, and also kind of how we need to reform the social contract, if that's even possible. And then the last section is on a new social contract, questions whether it's possible, feasible, or necessary. So I'm going to not go too deep into this because I did it in the last webinar, but in terms of climate change, so I like to be specific about climate change because a lot of people mix up what that term actually means. So climate is, I use the broad definition, which is the state of the climate. So it's the system of 5 major components and the interaction between these components. The most important thing about these definitions, these are from the IPCC, is that climate is affected by its own internal dynamics, but also by external forces, natural or anthropogenic. This is important because climate change actually can be natural, but to be most specific, what I'm talking about when I talk about climate change is the external forcings that are anthropogenic. So this is climate change can be naturally driven or human driven. So to define human driven climate change, so climate change in general is the state of the climate. It can be identified in the mean and or variability of properties that persist over time. Human driven are the external forces which are the direct or indirect result of human activity, or also, as the IPCC claims, the persistent anthropogenic changes in the composition of atmosphere or in land use. I don't specifically look at land use because I look at the composition of the atmosphere. I think that's what we generally tend to think about in terms of anthropogenic climate change. Strictly land use, that requires different questions, as I'll address in a minute. So my definition of climate change is this from the UNFCCC, which is Article 1. This has been the standard definition since 1992, which I think was the Stockholm Protocol, but any further references I make to climate change, I'm talking specifically about this Article 1, and it is human-driven anthropogenic climate change. So the reason we can discuss climate change and not environmental change is that, as I said in the last webinar, there's different process, different policies, different questions. Both of these entail normative and ethical questions, but the basis for the inquiry changes because we have to look at to whom are we obligated and to what action we are obligated. This is defined as positive and negative actions. What are we obligated to do and what are we obligated to refrain from doing? Any answer to these questions, it changes our basis for action. So this is where this plays into the social contract. Different processes, different policies, different questions, different social contracts. And for me, social contracts are between humans. There has been some debate whether we can have a social contract that includes the natural world or animals. That is very much out of my scope of knowledge, I would say, but there's really interesting theories if you are interested in those kind of social contracts. Contracts legally are a legally binding agreement between 2 or more parties. It's important to look at the kind of, I guess, common sense definitions, which usually come from law, because that's what informs most people's thinking about them. And when you look at contemporary social contract theory, they tend to rely a lot on the common sense definitions rather than the actual contractarian definitions. So yeah, a contract is consideration, intent, capacity, legality. All that means is consideration, it just needs to have an outcome, usually monetary. Intent, both parties need to intend to enter the contract, which is very important in terms of social contracts as well. Capacity is that you're able to enter it, and legality is just that the contract is legal. The contract theory definition is a binding agreement between all members of a society, which is very different to the legal definition. It's considered binding, not strictly in terms of laws, although laws actually can come into place in the social contract, as we'll have a look in a little bit. Consent is probably the most contested version. So again, we have the legal definition is an agreement by choice by one who has the freedom and capacity to make that choice. All that means is that you are free from duress, you're free from deception, so you know what you're consenting to, and capacity means that you are actually able to knowingly enter into a contract. The contract theory definition really only looks at two forms of consent, which are explicit and tacit. These relate pretty closely to express and implied. We don't really have informed consent in contract theory. There can be arguments that you can have informed consent, and unanimous, I guess, is kind of inherent in the idea of the social contract. Is that something that we all agree to? And finally, the social contract. So the classic definition is a hypothetical or historical agreement to give up certain freedoms to an authority in order to protect rights and or maintain social order. How we mostly think about it is that it legitimizes political authority. There have been different ways of thinking about it, as I'll go through in a few minutes. But what we usually learn, I guess, in political theory 101 is about the justification for government or political authority. There are contemporary definitions of the social contract. Again, these are way more, I guess, common sense definitions. So there's an agreement to live by certain rules or norms by a society in order to gain certain benefits. So the idea is that it legitimizes social arrangements. And then consent to collectively enforce social arrangements show arrangements have a normative property. Now, collectively enforced, this is important for the social contract. It doesn't just mean in terms of law, in terms of norms and how we regulate social behavior. So while something might not be illegal, we might not do it out of fear of embarrassment or social ostracization, which is very important in terms of the social contract, because we don't really have a social contract enshrined into modern judicial systems. So in general, I've tried to make the social contract, I guess, a little less theoretical and almost present a model of it, because it can be very complicated to try and compare them across different theorists, because they all use different versions and different origin points. So in general, we need a justificatory problem, an object of agreement, and an outcome with some normative property. One of the ways that was shown how to do this was if we look at a model. So this looks a bit complicated in terms of I chooses or in M that gives I star, et cetera, et cetera. You can read it there, but all it means is that the people in the original position, so whether this is the state of nature, which is what most of us are familiar with, they choose rules in a deliberative setting, which means that they enter into the social contract. And this gives people now a reason to comply with those rules in the real world if the reasons between the people in the original position can be shared by those people now. In terms of looking at, say, the state of nature and political authority, the idea is that we would have the same position as the people in the original position, because we don't want to descend back into a state of nature. We don't want to descend back into a state of insecurity and violence. Whether or not that actually really implies is one of the questions we will also address through this, but that is the model that I'm choosing, and it will actually form throughout the webinar. So I broke down social contract theory into early social contract, classical, contemporary, and then also creating a model of social contract theory. There are way more, and whether you can be classified as early, classic, contemporary, again, is contentious. I just did this in terms of making it easy to show the broad streams of thinking. So early social contract theory is concerned with justice, was represented in rules or laws, which if broken were punishable. It sought to bring legitimacy to the justice system. And social contract was actually seen as an agreement between peoples. It wasn't seen as an agreement between people and an authority, whether that be a legal or a political authority. One of the best known examples of this is in Plato's Republic. I think it's either in book 2 or book 3. Social contract was given by Glaucon as an answer to the question, what is justice? So while they looked at justice rather than political authority, the justification was very similar to classic social theory, in that the idea was that it's human nature to want to commit injustice against another person, but it's also human nature that our biggest fear is having injustice committed against us and not being able to retaliate or commit injustices against other people. So in this concept, people decided it was in their best interest to submit themselves to the convention of justice. So in this way, the social contract is formed for the collective benefit of justice, and people gave up their rights to commit injustices on one another in order to gain protection against injustice done on them. So it was more of a self-preservation rather than agreement to any specific order or institution. This is supposed to say classic, not early. Sorry, that was my fault. Classic social contract theory is probably what we're all mostly familiar with. It's usually what they teach you in your first semester of your first year of your undergrad of political theory. I think everyone has gone through this to death. So it's concerned with political authority, which is represented by a sovereign or governing body, depending on what theorist you're looking at. It sought to bring legitimacy to political entities, and the social contract was largely seen as an agreement between people and the state. So social contract is agreement between peoples and the state is what we mostly know is in Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau. But there also is someone that I would suggest, I'm not addressing him here, but Proudhon, very interesting anarchic philosopher who was actually active around the same time, if not a little bit after Rousseau. I would really suggest, if you are interested in a social contract between peoples that legitimizes political authority, to have a look at him. So Hobbes is what we most know in terms of Leviathan. So his origin point, state of nature. Similar to early contract theory, it was a preservation mechanism. So the idea that our origin point is the state of nature in where life is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. I think everyone knows that quote quite well. There was actually 2 agreements. The first agreement is an agreement to give up rights over other persons under the state of nature. This can be seen as an agreement between peoples, except for Hobbes, it's the second agreement that was the more important agreement, which was we give our single authority the power to enforce this first agreement. In that way, it's the sovereign for Hobbes rather than any specific government. He was trying to bridge the gap between the idea of the monarchy and the parliamentarians, which arguably, depending on your version of history, didn't go too well. And then so his idea was that legitimacy comes from the maintenance of peace and social order. That sounds a little more altruistic than what it actually was. Peace and social order isn't necessarily peace between peoples. The sovereign could actually be considered quite, had a monopoly of violence. It was more that people can't commit acts against each other. Locke is another one that's really well known. He had a very different view of the state of nature. His idea was that the state of nature is a state of perfect freedom and equality, but it was still a lot of insecurity within the state of nature. So people came together to form a social contract. So they would give up certain freedoms in order to secure natural rights, which is life, liberty, and property. So the legitimacy of the social contract, or the legitimacy of the political authority, came if the political authority acted as a neutral judge protecting life, liberty, and property. Very different to Hobbes' version of the sovereign or political authority. Locke had a much more limited view of how far that political authority could go. And now Rousseau, which is a little bit complicated. Rousseau actually had two ideas of the social contract, which comes in quite handy for what I'm going to talk about in terms of reforming the social contract. Social contract was before this considered a single point, where Rousseau decided that actually what would happen is that you could go back and revise the social contract. So his origin point is this idea, he has a much more natural version of it in that human society developed. And then once we created private property within the state of nature, then we needed a social contract. So the naturalized social contract was an agreement, this first social contract. And the contract claimed equality and protection for all, close to Locke's perception of life, liberty, and property. But Rousseau argued that it was actually an agreement between people who owned private property to establish an authority that protects this property, and then this was the start of inequality for Rousseau. So then in Du Contrat Social, or the social contract, he created the normative social contract, which is an agreement between all persons to live according to the collective will and not individual self-interest. I won't go too much into this because his idea of transferring individual will into the collective will is complicated, and after years I still don't fully understand it. But the legitimacy came if the authority acted in accordance with the will of all people. He didn't really think about a political authority per se. It was very much a form of direct democracy where all persons would come together to make agreements on how society lived and worked. Contemporary follows on a lot closer to Rousseau in terms of they look at how societies are organized and what norms we've agreed to, and to a certain extent what institutions we've put in place in order to secure these norms. So contemporary looks to seek legitimacy to social organizations, and the social contract is largely seen as an agreement between peoples. So Rawls is quite known for this one. His origin point is what we call the original position, where the reasonable frames the rational. So he had two principles of justice which were laid out in the social contract. So it was an agreement to principles of justice, social and legal organization, to regulate the distribution of civil liberties, social and economic goods through two principles. First one is that everyone has had to have as much liberty as possible without infringing on the liberty of other people. And then everyone has had to have the same access to social and economic goods. This sounds a little bit, again, more altruistic. What he meant is he actually did agree that there could be equality and inequality, but inequality is not unjust if every single person has access to the same potential to have economic and social goods. So the legitimacy comes from the agreement being set under the veil of ignorance. The idea that you create a society based on not knowing where your position in that society would be, not knowing your race, your gender, if or not you would have a disability. So it's the idea of creating the perfect society for all peoples. And legitimacy, again, comes from upholding the two principles. Again, this comes back to the idea of inequality. For him, inequality is only just if a person would not be better off under an alternative arrangement. So if you can think of an alternative arrangement that would make inequality less bad, to put it that simply, then you could create a new social construct. So go back to that model. So I said the people in the original position choose rules in a deliberative setting. This gives people now a reason to comply with the rules in the real world if the reasons between people in the original position can be shared by these people now. This leads us really to the question of, is the current social contract fit for purpose? And the next question is, if no, can we reform the social contract? This is where climate change and the social contract comes into play, because if we believe that we can reform the social contract, which way would we do it? What theory would we use? And like I said from my last webinar, a lot of people would contest even using political theory in terms of climate change, because climate change is a very specific scientific phenomenon, but it is being perpetuated by human action, which is why I'm so specific on what type of climate change that I'm talking about. So one of the reasons I use social contract theory is because there are parallels between the concept of being born into a society with an existing social contract. All social contract theories start from the idea that there was this original position and then this original agreement, not that people living when they were writing it actually had a say in what that social contract was. So there are parallels between that and then being born into a society with an existing structural system. The existing structural system is really just the system in which we've set up our own societies about. I use mostly the term economic welfare or the globalized economy, but really it can be any principle, because we've heard the social contract being used for many things. When we talk about race relations, we need a new social contract. Talk about social inequality, we need a new social contract. You've heard it being used in a lot of ways. And for me, climate change is primarily an economic problem in terms of what is the human action that's largely contributing and perpetuating climate change. So like I said, modern societies, they've inherited this structural system that's contributing to climate change the same way social contracts are inherited in contract theory. The structural system, it's persisted despite the knowledge of climate change because it's consented to, the same way social contracts persist in contract theory. So, like I said before, the notion of consent is very highly contested. I do argue that it can be carried through, because if we look at the concept of tacit consent, which is pretty much in every contractarian theory, a lot of people, again, the common sense definition we would think of a contract is that we explicitly agree to it, that we outwardly say that we agree to it. This isn't true in terms of social contract theory. Consent is tacit. So I used Locke's argument mostly that tacit consent was given to the government because one used and enjoyed a country's immunities. So if we use that argument, we can look at things like wealth and economic prosperity as being similar to immunities such as security and social order under the contract theory. Obviously, this is very Western based. This comes from more of a informative that we need a new social contract on climate change in Western high polluting countries. I'm not speaking about other cultures outside of kind of Western liberal democracies. So for me, what I said is an enjoyment of a modern Western lifestyle. It signals tacit consent to the continuation of the modern structural system. The problem in here is that legally and also under contract theory, enjoyment is not sufficient to signal consent. So it's not sufficient because when we talked about consent, it has to be free from duress and deception. So if you are living in the modern structural system, you were born into the system, so all of your actions are shaped and constrained by this system. You don't have any choice really to not interact with this system. So in legal theory, tacit consent is inferred from the silence of a party when presented with the opportunity to refuse or reject a proposal. This is why that we can overcome this idea of enjoyment, because if we allow the continuation of activity without interference, then we tacitly consent to it. In this way, it's confusing because it can be really an active and passive act at the same time. It's about knowing what's going on, knowing why and what the consequences of it is, but allowing it to happen anyway. It's not as simple as people weren't aware that climate change was happening. This is very much applying to now, where people know the impacts of climate change and we know why it's happening and how it's happening and who it's affecting, but we're continuing to let it continue anyway. So if tacit consent needs to be voluntary and free from actions, and then if we look at the fact that if we look at our actions are shaped and constrained by the system, tacit consent to a social contract that's perpetuating climate change is not possible. So this is where I come with the massive passive and active action. So my definition for tacit consent is the failure to act when a certain response from individuals is required. This is going to be contested, and I'm pretty sure it's going to be contested in the comments and questions at the end. But this is really the only view of consent that I can think of that actually would replicate what is going on nowadays in terms of climate change. So if we analyze the current social contract, so to really simplify what a social contract is, it's an agreement to live by certain rules or norms by member of society in order to gain social benefits. These are benefits that would not be able to be gained without cooperation, so without the organization of society. And then these benefits completely rely on guaranteed cooperation. So this is the idea that we would get rid of the free rider problem, which would stop people from stop people from actually committing fully to these actions, knowing that they could benefit from other people doing it. We can look at in terms of cooperation. So our ideas of like security wouldn't be possible without societal cooperation. These can be laws. We need to all be in agreement that laws need to be enforced. It's not that everyone has to act legally all the time, but the agreement is that the laws have to be enforced. Public services can be something as simple as infrastructure. When you live in a modern state, you drive down a road, you have street lights. These have all been paid for by taxes, which is technically, under social contract theory, giving up part of your liberty over your own property to the state for a benefit that wouldn't be possible without it. And then my main thing that I look at is economy. So this is your national economy, but also participation in the global economy. The participation in the global economy is not possible without a nation state of some kind. We also tend to look at justice and fairness as part of the benefits we can gain through cooperation. And these aren't really justice and fairness in terms of, I guess, legally, or they're more ideas of justice in that we agree that everybody should be treated equally regardless of gender. That's justice. Fairness, everybody should have access to the same schools, which is why we have public schools. These are things that are not legally mandated, and they're not something you get purely based off being a member of a state. It's something you get because we've all agreed that it's something that is necessary for society. So the analytical starting point here is that the globalized economy is at the center of contract theory and climate change. Why I've said this is that economic prosperity is the justifying basis for the continuation of the structural system that is perpetuating climate change. We can see this in the way that when we look at opposition to climate change is often based on economic considerations. We can't do so-and-so action because it will take away from the money that will go to security or social security. You hear this so often. Or if we regulate carbon emissions, then our businesses won't want to come here, and then that will lower our revenue that's available for public services. You always hear this in politics, no matter which country you're in. Another thing is that constraint and mitigation efforts are often put through economic reasoning. So we can't put sulfur caps on top of smoke chimneys because it's really expensive and it stops the amount of heat being produced. And it's not anywhere once you start realizing they use economic, but then they relate that back to your public or social good. But it's always an economic consideration. And then economic welfare is seen as the central mean to secure overall human welfare. What I mean by that is if we look at something like we look at the developmental status of countries. What do we use to measure that? We use GDP and GNI per capita. We do have the Human Development Index, but the Human Development Index, it correlates highly with economic wealth. Countries that are considered economically wealthy, the people living in them are considered to have better welfare. That's how we look at the world in general. Higher economic wealth, better overall welfare for humans. So we have 3 analytical questions when looking at the social contract coming from the starting point. What was the justificatory problem? What was the objective agreement? And what was the outcome and what normative property? So what problem were we trying to solve by creating an economy and organizing ourselves around an economy? What did we really agree to? And the outcome is the economy, but we have to look at why it has a normative property, which is usually this idea that economic welfare is essential for overall human welfare. That's the normative property that a lot of people use. So I just put it in the green box because these can be a little bit complicated, the model and the 3 questions. I thought it was just easier to keep them on top. So if we look at the current social contract as economic development, we have we're kind of starting, I guess, from the bottom first. So the outcome is this globalized economy. The normative property is that economic prosperity results in other types of prosperity. But we have a lot of questions in what was the object of the agreement? So if we were in the original position, whether it be the state of nature, did we really agree to organize society around an economy, or is the economy something that's just an outcome of another object of agreement? The justificatory problem is very difficult to know because economic development seems to be something that has been naturalized into human development. And we've seen that with the kind of perpetuation of the notion of industrialized development, which is slightly being overcome by sustainable development, but not by much. So we don't really know what the justificatory problem was. It's very difficult to know what it was. So that's why I said it's better to think of the problem as a question of, is organization around the economy really a result of solving the justificatory problem? So we're forming the social contract. So if you believe that economy should not be the center of the social contract or the main outcome of a social contract, you kind of need to ask 2 questions. So first, the idea is that the social contract is formed on a justifying basis. So these have to be benefits sufficient enough to give up certain freedoms. Like I said, giving up certain freedoms over your property through taxes to get public infrastructure. And the social contract can only persist because it continues to provide this benefit. So it's only legitimate so long as it continues to provide this benefit. So then we need to ask, is economic prosperity a benefit sufficient to justify the current social contract given we face catastrophic climate change? This goes back to what I said, where climate action is often left out because it threatens economic action. But we have to ask, is this a benefit sufficient enough to ignore the need for climate change action and effective and quick climate change action? So if we model a climate social contract, this would be coming around, I guess, to a new contract. This is very, very broad, and it's very much not really, I guess, based on any concepts of maybe shared values or norms, or around the kind of more moral or ethical issues, because that is a whole other set of considerations for a social contract. But just looking at a model, we know that the justificatory problem is that we're facing catastrophic climate change. This is known, it's set. So we need to look at what our object of agreement is. So we need to create a new system that prioritizes climate change mitigation, or do we need to modify the existing system to prioritize the preservation of our climate system? So the object of agreement 1 would be very close to those people who agree that we need to get rid of capitalism in general and create a whole new system. It's not saying that we don't need an economic system, but we just need a whole new system of economics that prioritizes climate change. The second one is a little bit more moderate. It says that we can have economic growth and prosperity in the same way we do now, as long as it doesn't threaten any kind of climate change action or preservation of the environment. This is almost an inverse of the current reasoning as to why climate change action can't take place because of economic prosperity. We need to reverse those two. The outcome would be rules and values and norms that place climate preservation above purely economic interest. This would be something that would need to be agreed amongst people, not strictly just a policy, which is why we need a social contract, because it really requires a lot of commitment. And the normative property is human survival. As basic and uncomplicated as it is, that is the normative property. Why would we be doing this? Human survival. So now we come to a new social contract. So these are more questions, I guess, because it really hasn't been explored too far on what a new social contract could be. It's used a lot, it's thrown around a lot. Pretty much every major world speech you're going to hear about COVID recovery is going to have a mention of social contract in it, because I already have. It's coming from every UN institution. So we need to agree in order for this to keep going that you need a new social contract. It's required in the context of climate change, but for me, it doesn't require the dismantling of the globalized economy. So we go back to this original position. So similar to the state of nature, we are facing a justificatory problem, which is climate change. It's not feasible or necessary to dismantle the globalized economy. Why? Because every single contractarian focuses on the idea of self-interestedness. So human nature, which is self-interestedness, was not changed by the social contract. It didn't go away. We all didn't become altruistic. Even in Rousseau and Rawls, they say that everything comes down to self-interest. It was just regulated. So we had destructive self-interest. It was constrained by the agreement. And this agreement was that there is a higher and even more self-interested good. So it's very much not altruistic at all, as much as a lot of people from the social contract would like to interpret, especially the more modern of Rousseau and Rawls. It was all about self-interestedness. My problem here is that surely human survival is the highest self-interested good we can have. It's something that we can all agree on, we all have in our self-interest. But knowing this and knowing the effects of climate change and knowing what's going to happen, why do we not have an agreement already to place effective climate change mitigation above economic self-interestedness? So these raise the questions which will need to be addressed, I guess, in further thinking, and I guess maybe we can talk a little bit about them. Is there more to the social contract than pure self-interestedness? If you read a lot of the theory, it's a lot of the time based on self-interestedness. But how we have changed, if you think about contemporary social contracts, it's a lot more based on what we think is right and good and fair. It's not necessarily based around self-interested. So while we can use social contract theory, the contractarians from the early and the classic, we have to think about whether their assumptions were correct in terms of self-interestedness. So this key outcomes are the values and norms we organize society around based only on self-interestedness considerations. So we're all growing up in every version of the languages that we speak. You probably heard treat others as you want to be treated. Something most people would have heard as a child. Is such a common phrase, but that's a self-interested phrase. That's not an altruistic. You treat other people the way they want to treat you. That has been the basis of most social contracts. Can we even have a new social contract based on climate change? If theory dictates it's based on self-interested reasoning, then this has not yet been effective in tackling climate change. So you have to ask whether or not this social contract is really the best way to go. And then another thing, which is again the most contentious bit, if we do not undertake action to reform the social contract, are we consenting to climate change? I say yes, because a failure to act when a response from individuals required for me is what tacit consent is. Clearly a response is required, and currently there is a large failure to act. And that is the end.
Thank you, that was really great. Could you show the last slide again with the questions?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. All right. So how do you want to, do you just want to moderate the discussion part here? I think that will make sense.
Yeah. Okay, Grant, I've got everyone's faces up now. Yeah, so if anyone has any questions, comments, rebuttals, I'm sure there's a few coming. Yeah, you can either speak here, or if you're not in a place where you can use your microphone, we've used the chat box a few times as well.
I mean, I had one idea pretty early on during your presentation was just like a really superficial comment for now, was that the idea of, or like ideas of convivialism might also be very interesting when you're talking about climate change, or like anything environment related, really, and contractarianism. But like, because with convivialism and maybe an anti-speciesist viewpoint, that would just get like way more complex, right? Especially regarding issues like consent. Yeah, so that's just the first comment that I wrote up really early on.
Yeah. One reason why I use social contract is mainly because it is talked about so often and not correctly. I know that sounds really terrible, but it's not used correctly, and it's just thrown around all the time, where actually a social contract could be a very effective method because it requires agreement between peoples. Now, agreements between governments are not effective. Who's sticking to their NDCs? Who has met, like, did anyone meet their Kyoto targets? Anybody? Nope. So, the USA dropped out of the Paris Climate Agreement because someone was in the White House that didn't like it. There's no repercussion. So for me, a political solution is kind of moot unless it has will of people, which for me is the social contract.
Interesting.
I had a question. Should we go one by one, or should I just go ahead and ask?
No, go ahead and ask.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much for the wonderful presentation, Lisa. And I was really glad to hear that someone mentioned a profound at some point. So that was really nice. I'm currently working on this intersection between ideal and non-ideal theory. And obviously, social contract theory is very much in ideal theory. And I wondered why you would want to have a social contract on such a the pressing issue right now that we have, because obviously there are some critics of the ideal theory or social contract theory from Trustness, from Fairley, and I'm not sure if social contract really can bring a perspective to this kind of an issue, because it's quite abstract in itself. And given that we are dealing with a theory, I'm trying to understand what is your purpose, or like what is the thing that you see bringing as a new perspective to this debate?
So for me, the social contract, so a lot of the work that, a lot of research that I do is looking at how social movements influence policy. So that's largely where this comes. If you look at climate action, the real kick, a huge amount of policies came in after Fridays for Future. This was a group of people coming together that said, no more, no, we're done. And because it got so much publicity, because it was considered, I guess, the will of the people or the will of the future citizens, a lot of people came forward. Now, a lot of this action was largely superficial, but it was something. And for me, I think we have a tendency to go towards politics as usual until we have a fundamental shift in how society organizes itself and what society agrees on. It probably is a little bit idealistic, and I'm not saying that this would really reflect in like major policy shifts per se, but in terms of the social contract, if there was some sort of agreement between peoples that we need to place certain benefits and certain values and norms above economic prosperity, I think we would get a lot further than we are now, because people are very, very happy to say, of course I want to stop climate change, but they're not doing anything. You know, you can walk in a march and that's great, but if you're filming it on your iPhone and then you're going more clearly on, there's a huge debate in terms of the use of the value of environmental ethics in solving environmental problems. It's a huge debate. It started in the late 90s and it's still ongoing. And for me, yeah, I'm trying to develop a theory of how ethical normative inquiry is important for addressing these issues. So it goes beyond self-interestedness. It goes, yeah, to what you said, to what do we owe each other and why? Because a lot of the times most people are asking, what can we do? How can we do it? But not really, why should we be doing it and why should we not be doing it? It's just a little bit complicated, I think, to patch out here until I fully have worked out the theory clearly in my head.
I had another question in that direction. I guess at first, how should we imagine the role of a new social contract here? Isn't the matter of bringing about the fundamental shift you're talking about more a question of mobilization of people with an interest in such a shift?
For me, it's very simple, is that it's prioritizing climate change mitigation above other, so above economic interestedness. That's, for me, that's quite the simple route. And it's obviously way more complicated in practice, but a lot of people, a lot of stuff that I'm reading, it's, we need radical changes. We need this. It's like, we actually just need a fundamental change in where our priorities are. But again, that turns into the normative ethical inquiry, because no one's going to change their priorities just because someone told them to. I mean, we haven't done it yet, and we've known since the 70s, so.
What's the difference between fundamental change and radical change, though? Isn't that the same thing, like a fundamental change in priorities? I mean, sure, but I would argue that at least in some countries, large parts of the populace already agree, already favor action on climate change and on climate change mitigation, and nothing's happening. And
yeah.
The preferences, I think, are at least in some places already in place. Nevertheless, nothing is happening due to, well, loads of factors, and certainly more than I can account for now. But for instance, like one example that just came to mind is that in Germany, when coal plants are being closed sooner than their contract was with the state is going to pay those damages. Same thing for nuclear plants. Obviously, that doesn't really concern climate change, but it goes toward the same problem here. This interaction between the state and the economy makes it so that it can never really be attractive for states to act upon these issues in a way we might like. No?
For me, one of the things is that the difference. So radical change is this idea that we need a whole systems change. I don't think we need I just think we need to rearrange our priorities. We don't need this radical. Like, if we could get to a point where we had a way more green and fair and capitalist economic system, or even get rid of capitalism, that'd be great. But that's not going to happen in the time that we need it to in order to address climate change. I mean, we're 9 years away, 2030, and actually we're shorter away. They're just not putting it out there. They still say 2030. It's not 2030. It's nearly 2025 at this point that we have irreversible damage. So that's my main problem with that. Another thing is purported public opinion does not reflect political priorities. It's something that doesn't happen. If you say, are you in favor of climate change? Everyone's going to say, well, not everyone, but they're going to say yes, because there's a positive affirmation bias. But when it comes to actually voting people in, if so many people were in favor, why aren't politicians with very strong environmental and climate change rhetoric getting voted in? Or why aren't more people just simply saying, there's no one here for me, so I'm going to run? In most countries, it's not like the States where you're almost blocked and you have to be put in by certain people. It's not like that. So I know from Ireland, like, you can run as an independent, which is the main way that people with very different views from parties tend to get in. So for me, while public opinion seems to be one way, it's really often still reflects. People in Scotland wanted independence, overwhelmingly. And then they were told, well, we'll take the NHS away from you. So they voted not for independence. That's how economics is used. And that's my main problem, is that, one, people are blatantly lying. In my opinion, there's a lot of lying going on in terms of what will actually happen if we prioritize climate change mitigation. But also, it's very hard to say, if you say to someone, this very abstract thing is going to happen, and it's not going to happen to you, but it might happen to your grandchildren, versus you've got a family right now and your main thing is economic. You're wondering how you're going to get them through, which is also why there's a huge difference in terms of, you're not really going to find a huge amount of environmental or climate advocates, say, in lower socioeconomic groups. Not because people don't care in those economic groups, but because they just have other priorities. So that's, for me, why the social contract comes in, because we need to figure out a way to agree how to align our priorities, because essentially it all comes back to economics, because we've centered our society around economics. If you don't have economic welfare, you can't prosper. That's how we've formed our society. And we like to agree that it's something that's totally external to us that we can't change, but why not?
I'm less about, my issue is less about, I definitely believe we could change the economic system, but whose preferences then need to change exactly? Everybody's. It's just a matter of people want it, but it's not prioritized high enough.
Yeah.
But then the way it sounds, and I'm really not sure if I'm understanding you right, the way it sounds when you're talking about people, like, for instance, running as an independent, like their livelihoods are also involved in such courses of action, right? It actually is a matter of like how much time do you have in a day to become politically involved, and like how likely is it even that you think of that? Because like the way I understand it, like we have democratic but not like formally democratic societies maybe, but not really politicized societies in that way. And it just sort of sounds like you're putting a lot of on the individuals, or like all individuals as individuals, to come up with a new social contract. And how, like I missed out on that because then the feed cut out for me. How am I to imagine that? Like how is everybody gonna come together?
But this is why it's wrong, because we often think of a contract as an explicit agreement that we all need to come together as society and explicitly say we want to fight climate change. That's not really how it's going to work, and it's really complicated, because when I get into the normative ethical inquiry, it's easier, but it's really hard to summarize that in a webinar, because it's a lot of moving parts that just can't be presented like this. But for me, it's not individuals as individuals. This is what I was saying before. So it's this idea of an agreement between all peoples, because we have the free rider problem. Someone else will do it, you know, like, oh, well, someone else will vote for someone who's in favor of climate action. But for me right now, I have to prioritize this, this, and this, which is true. You know, people do have to prioritize their own survival, but it's about recognizing that we've organized that there is an organizing principle, that we have organized our societies around an economy. You know, that this is where the social contract comes. This is why I say you have to analyze the current social contract, because we think that this economy is completely external, but it's not. You know, if there was collective movement, it's not that one individual and lots of different individuals have to do it. It really kind of has to be something that we all come together as a society, which is very abstract, and is really most of the problems with social contract theory, is that these hypothetical agreements that somehow everybody agreed to at some deliberation point, it's very hard to apply that to such a concrete issue as what's happening now, because it seems like we would need an explicit agreement. But we don't really need an explicit agreement. You know, there's a lot of priorities that could come together to put climate change mitigation. You know, my way that I do it, like I could prioritize energy, and you could prioritize something else. Like, it's just that you have to change your fundamental organizing principle. Right now, the organizing principle is economic wealth, economic prosperity, because we think, great, that's human development, that's human prosperity. We need to change the organizing principle, which in my mind requires a social contract, because in social contract theory, how we form society in the first place, what we organize ourselves around, whether that be justice or government, came from a social contract. So why can't we switch our organizing principle, which for me would be the social contract? Not strictly we all sit down and write an explicit agreement, but that organizing principle.
All right, so if I'm getting you right, the social contract would be less the method of mobilization, of like getting people there, but sort of the end goal, or like a goal, the result of mobilization that should result from it.
Yeah.
Okay, that makes more sense to me then.
Yeah, all the social contract really is that, like, it's the agreement to collectively enforce something we've already agreed on, our organization principle. You know, we all rationally and reasonably came together and realized that something was in our best self-interest, so we agreed to that. And this is why I don't like Hobbes's theory, but I like the two ideas of the two contracts, is that we all came together first and agreed something, and then we decided to give over authority to enforce that. I like that two ideas, because, you know, the social contract, it describes an outcome and it gives an ability to collectively enforce an outcome, but that's not where the outcome originates. You know, even if you think of a legal contract, what your contract is over, it already exists in the first place. So this thing has to exist first, and then we need to come together in order to find a way how we can collectively organize ourselves around something we've already agreed to, and then use that as our new basis for organizing society. Which I'm now sounding actually a lot more radical than I usually sound in my seminars. I usually get in a lot of trouble for being too much a pragmatist. But in my mind, that's how it would work. But this is very theoretical.
So I hope I'm not getting in before anyone else, because I'm. Oh yeah, Thomas, why don't you ask your question first?
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you for your presentation. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
It's a bit broken up.
Sorry, can you hear me?
I can hear you clearer now.
My question is climate change really a vital topic or issue considering the disagreements, the issue with global hopes and all of these? Is climate change a really vital issue for renegotiating the social contract?
For me, yes. The thing about it is, so I tend to look, the reason I get very specific about it.
Is it really a viable option for renegotiating the social contract?
I currently think it's the only option. We're facing catastrophic climate change. Like, this is as close to what I can think about as terms of getting to a state of nature. We're getting to a point where the way that we have our lives, like, I don't want to go out of the way and be like, all humans are going to be taken off the planet, because we know that's unlikely to actually happen for a very long time. But how we live our lives is going to fundamentally change. And my major problem, why I don't talk about it too often in these, is because it does confuse it. It brings in climate justice. Is we do have this damaging societies and almost getting rid of societies. Pacific Islands are going to be underwater by a certain amount of time. That's countries and cultures disappearing. That is the end of their societies. We tend to think of society as one way, but it's not. We're losing societies as we go along. For me, there are so many moving parts of climate change. It does require a huge amount of social inequality, wealth redistribution. But why I talk very specifically about the human action contributing to climate change, I like to talk specifically about mitigation, because for me, that's the root of the problem. We're still contributing to climate change rather than mitigating it. We can have adaptation. For me, that's a principle of justice, and that will probably come out of if we created a social contract, but we're getting as close to a state of nature that we can right now, in my mind. Like, as alarmist as it might sound.
Thank you for highlighting.
Yeah.
Thank you for highlighting the issue of climate justice. Thank you for highlighting the issue of climate justice. I think it's incredibly important. Yeah. But if you look at the sensitivity of the issue of climate change, most of the nations emitting the greenhouse gases are Western industrialized democracies, and nations at the periphery of the society, like sub-Saharan African states and states in Latin America, are the least in terms of emission, because most of them are unindustrialized. So if we are renegotiating the social contracts, won't that be injustice if one party is more towards destroying the climate and creating a problem. And they are pushing for renegotiation of the social change on the basis of climate change. So is it really an essential issue, or is it an issue of climate injustice?
So I did make the point to say that when I am talking about who consented to climate change, I am talking about people who are currently enjoying a very Western high consumption lifestyle. So I am very much coming from a Western perspective, in that I'm talking about highly developed and industrialized nations. That's like my specific focus is on those people. So we get impatient, Jerry. Yeah, so that's really is my focus, is on those people. So, people living in Western democracies, high consumption countries. Those are really where, and see the social contract, so it's hard. So I talk about the organizing, the organizing principles, so how we organize our societies. It gets very complicated when we talk about, say, organizing the global society. I think Jintao brought it up the last time. Can there be a social contract between other countries? That gets very complicated. But for me, it would be it's more the people who are contributing directly to climate change. Like, we need to stop this specific action of contributing, rather than people who are maybe living in lower consumption countries. They don't have to necessarily, I guess, come into this. Like, because people in these countries are already putting a lot of the time climate change above certain things. It's just the responsibility for me is on Western countries, because of I wouldn't want to go into it, but the idea of historic responsibility for emissions, that's a huge informative point for me. And then unequal distribution of the benefits and drawbacks of climate change, in that we've all benefited from climate change because we got to burn all the fuel and developed our economies, whereas other countries in the global south have not benefited at all and are getting all the consequences. It is, I guess, part of the normative consideration, which I didn't address because I wanted to be very, very specific. But yeah, it would go to a question: can we have a global social contract? Which is a whole other question.
Thomas, if that
very interesting.
Sorry.
What I find interesting is when nations are negotiating the social, as it relates to climate change. I know you are referring to Western democratic countries, but most of the burden of climate change are being felt equally by countries in other areas. So they change as a result of massive industrialization and destruction of the layer by Western democratic nations in a couple of that all across the world. So once we refer to Western democracies, it has some sort of corollaries on African democracies and African institutions and on the African.
Yeah.
So these are issues we consider holistically and not just climate change.
Yeah.
We must all consider it from one perspective, because we live on this planet. So we are all affected by climate change one way or the other. So any action taken democracies will automatically affect countries. What about using or by education? So we consider other point of justice or injustices as we go further.
Yeah. So because you're breaking up, I didn't quite get everything, but I think I got the. Yeah. Oh no, I know, but so for me, so yeah, but the social contract isn't a negotiation. it isn't world leaders coming together to create an explicit contract. The social contract is an organizing principle of society. It's the fundamental thing that we organize our societies around. Right now, we organize our societies around economy. I'm talking about Western liberal countries. They organize their, and to an extent, we've enforced that on the rest of the world. You know, even look at how we differentiate development. It's economic as much as we want to say that it's human and social. We mostly look at economic development. So for me, it's very much about, this isn't going to be a negotiation. And whether it can be a global social contract, that's a very complicated question. It's a whole other aspect of social contract theory. But for me, it would be the social contract is what we organize, what is the founding principle that we organize our societies around. And then how do we make sure that we're all held collectively responsible to that organizing principle? It's not a negotiation. So in some countries, it will look very different to others. And the reason that I talk specifically about Western liberal democracies is because they are the high polluting countries and they have the historic responsibility for climate change, which in my opinion means that they have the largest responsibility to fix the problem. And the fact that it's continuing in these societies means that we need to change the organizing principle of the societies that are contributing the most to climate change first.
Yeah. If that satisfied your questions, Thomas, which, because you muted yourself again, I think it did. I don't want to make you stay on longer. We're already way beyond the time. I would have another question that I would really like to ask, but like if you have to take care of your dogs, for instance, that would be totally fine.
He just gets a bit weird. He needs to go out, but I'll take him out in 5 minutes.
Okay, so to be clear, and I wanted to say this earlier because like we were talking a lot about like how much sense does it really make to apply contractarianism to the issue of climate change. And I would say on a fundamental level, I think it's always worthwhile to apply any theory to a topic, an object that it hasn't really been applied to. And in that regard, like, thank you for this presentation. It's been really enlightening, and I've never really thought about it from this perspective. But then on the issue of like the new social contract, you were saying, as I believe I understood you correctly, that we need like everyone, or like mostly everyone, to agree, at least tacitly, in this new organizing principle that is directed at climate preservation, or at least mitigating the effects of climate change and climate change itself, instead of the economy. And this doesn't have to be explicit. We don't have to write anything down. It doesn't have to be ratified on a state-by-state level or anything. So in how far is it then still different from saying we need everyone to agree to the climate change is ready, for instance, and then that we have to do something against, and then voting the appropriate parties and so on, engaging in their societies? Like, isn't it just basically saying we need everyone to agree that we have to do something about climate change?
Yeah, in a sense. So everyone can agree we need to do something, but agreement doesn't result in action. So just because I say something doesn't mean that I'm going to do it. Maybe I didn't make it more clear. So what it is the reasoning we don't have to get rid of the economy. It's about changing priorities. Is that right now in our current situation, if you have a choice between a better climate outcome and a better economic outcome, people choose the economic outcome, well, particularly policy. And then if you only have one choice, then say for people, and you have to choose a climate outcome or a personal economic outcome, people choose the personal economic outcome, which again is understandable. But the problem is that when everybody's doing this, even the people, because a lot of people use it as a justifying basis. oh, so-and-so is doing that, so I can do it. Again, it's the free rider problem. Everybody needs to be on the same page, because otherwise we get free riders, and free riders just break down this whole idea of cooperation for a social benefit. The minute one person doesn't do it, because it's hard. Mitigating climate change is hard, and it means we're going to have to give up certain things to do it. But, you know, a lot of people want to talk about how we don't need to give up things, and we will need to give up things. The same as in the social contract. You gave up certain liberties in order to gain a greater social benefit. We need to do that now. We need to figure out, you know, when it comes to the idea of choosing your economic or your climate outcome, you're going to have to give up this idea that you're entitled to your economic outcome in order to choose climate. And this will need to be an agreement amongst all people. And hopefully that will filter up into government, but I look at it mostly from a organizing perspective, like how we organize our societies rather than how that reflects in our politics. Because if we don't, the minute one person doesn't do it, you know, no one's going to do it. If your neighbor down the street doesn't follow your housing association rules, you know, the two things that could happen. If everyone is in agreement that these housing association rules are absolutely necessary and for the good of the whole community, that person will be forced to do it through either fines or whatever, or through actual, you know, social shaming and social ostracization. If people aren't in agreement, they're just sort of going along with the rules, and one person breaks them, they're like, oh great, well I can do it because not everyone's doing it. So that's where the problem comes in.
Yeah, so to mitigate climate change, we have to get everyone to agree that we have to mitigate climate change, prioritize it appropriately, and then everybody has to act accordingly.
Yeah, which is the problem with social contract theory.
Yeah, okay. All right.
Yeah, it's about, it's not so much about, I guess it's kind of complicated to talk about specifically about climate change, but sorry, he's very bossy. It's unfair to say I have a dog. The dog has me. And on occasion, my boyfriend as well. Oh, I completely forgot what I was saying now. Oh, no, I've lost it.
I mean,
oh, no, there we go. It's about the values. So if, you know, a lot of people talk about, this is where the problem again of the ethic normal kind of inquiry comes in. It's very complicated to see it from the abstract, because we just have to be like, okay, well, we all just have to agree that climate change is a problem. What is it? We're on 99.7% of scientists, overwhelmingly public opinion. The majority of people do believe it's real. But why has this not resulted? You know, we know the clock is getting closer and closer and closer. Why hasn't this resulted in it? Because it's not just about knowing and agreeing. It's about making it so fundamental to our societies that we just do it. It's the right thing to do. You know, whether that be normative or in very much the contractarian theory, purely self-interested, doesn't matter. Preservation of, you know, humans are supposed to be at the absolute center of what we do. But right now, that's not where we are. We're at improving economic wealth and prosperity, not overall human survival, which I think is pretty crazy how we've gotten that far away from our evolutionary basis. But that's a whole other set of theories, I guess.
I mean, for one, I think I could keep discussing this for hours, but my core questions have been answered really satisfyingly. Thank you.
No worries.
Unless the others have anything else to add, I might suggest ending it here. We're quite a bit beyond our time, so I will end the recording here for now, and maybe we can talk a little bit afterwards. So anyways, thank you all for coming, for participating in the discussion, for asking all the interesting questions we had, and thank you, Lisa, for giving this presentation to us and being so amazing with reacting to our questions and our confusion, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll have another session next month. That time it will be me who will be presenting, and I have no idea what it's going to be about, so that's going to be exciting. And I'm really looking forward to that. Almost forgot that. Thank you to everyone else who was there and had to leave already because we're so far above our time. So yeah, see you next time, YouTube.